I'm Cindy Penrose, the Chief Operating Officer of the Paul Ramsay Foundation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to International Women's Day event tonight on leadership in social justice, courage, collaboration and change. I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Can I particularly welcome the students from Bonnyrigg High School and St Mary's Senior High School. Thank you so much for travelling to be here with us tonight. There has been no shortage of courageous women around Australia and indeed the world speaking up and out in pursuit of gender equality and gender equality irrespective of race, disability or other backgrounds. We've seen this courage in the form of our Australian of the Year, Grace Tame, advocating for the right of children and women who've survived abuse. Excuse me. So too, we see it in the areas of reform in child protection, the justice system, equal access to employment opportunities and a safe workplace. With all that has occurred since last we gathered this time last year to celebrate this occasion, now is the moment to reflect on the great courage and collaboration of the women leaders in our sector and their ambitions for change. Which is why it is my great honour tonight to introduce our esteemed panel of speakers to explore pivotal moments in their career and what change might look like to them. On our panel tonight are rock stars. Far from me, the Honourable Verity Firth, Executive Director, Social Justice at the University of Technology, Sydney, where she heads up the university's Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion. She was previously the New South Wales Minister for Education and Training and the Minister for Women and CEO of the Public Education Foundation. Please welcome Verity. Kate Eastman, SC, calls herself a feminist, committed to gender equality, who happens to work as a barrister in one of the most male-dominated professions in our country. Kate has 30 years' experience in dispute resolution and advocacy in a wide range of employment disputes, all aspects of discrimination law, and is currently counsel assisting the Disability Royal Commission. Kate might be known to you for the matters that she's done on Fraser Kirk, David Jones, Israel Folau and Michelle Guthrie. Please welcome Kate. Teela Reid is a proud Wiradjuri and Whalan woman, lawyer and storyteller. Teela was one of Australia's leading voices in the fight for constitutional recognition of First Nations people. Teela is passionate in her fight against systemic racism and intergenerational trauma of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and she currently sits on the advisory committee of the Wallama Court proposal, a model that would see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders involved in the sentencing decisions in court. Teela is also part of an all-female organising team for Australia's Rebellious Lawyer Conference, coming in September this year. Stay tuned. Please welcome Teela. Jennifer Robinson is an Australian human rights lawyer and barrister with Doughty Street Chambers in London. Before coming to the bar, she founded the Bertha Justice Initiative and is Director of Legal Advocacy for the Bertha Foundation in London, a global interest law program to encourage law students to pursue careers in human rights. Best known for her work as legal advisor to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and more recently represented Amber Heard in the blockbuster libel trial. Please welcome Jen. Tonight's panel session will be moderated by the fabulous Ashley Raper, the ABC's New South Wales State political reporter. Ashley, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Cindy, and welcome everybody. We do gather here at quite a moment. We have young women, some of them just girls, calling out sexual assault across the country and demanding change. And the microscope on the treatment of women is reaching the hierarchy in the legal and political professions. So I want to ask firstly, how this is playing out, what do you think it says about how far we've come in Australia, or how far we haven't come in terms of female empowerment? I'll start with you, Verity.
I think it says A bit of both, actually. I think probably what's inspired me most about this cultural moment is the incredible bravery of young women to speak up and to be, and we were talking about it earlier, in fact, and to be absolutely unashamed and to say, this happened to me, it was wrong that it happened to me, and I feel no personal shame because of it, and I will tell the world that. And I think that is unbelievably powerful, and I think that is a cultural and generational shift. The downside of it is that I think it has yet again brought home how much things haven't really changed. And in fact, it's quite depressing in that respect. I mean, I myself was a staffer in Canberra in the 90s, and I genuinely, it looks like absolutely nothing has changed. And if anything, it seems to have got worse. So on International Women's Day, when we were also looking at all sorts of other indicators of women's progress, including the equal pay gap, you know, the pay gap and gendered work, and none of those indicators had changed either. So the positive is, I think we've got this amazing generation, and I think we've got this cultural moment of solidarity and wanting to change the world, but we've got to make sure we actually seize it.
Kate, does it inspire you? Are you optimistic, or does it depress you?
A little bit of both. I think, you know, we're at a point in time where we really are very critical about our institutions and the people who hold power. And I think we got caught up, well, I certainly got caught up in what was happening in the US, and just sort of horrified that men who have such disrespect for women could hold such high positions of power. But at the same time, we're losing trust in our institutions of power, and that creates a vacuum, and into a vacuum is an opportunity. So as angry and as wild as we feel about the men who have been our leaders, we're losing trust in them, and that's an opportunity for us as women to think quite creatively and innovatively about different ways and look at leadership and then say, we are entitled to be part of the leadership, not just to choose the leaders, but to be leaders as well.
Teela, do you think this is an opportunity to seize, or?
Look, I think I should first acknowledge, you know, we're here on the sovereign lands and waters of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation that have never ceded this country, and we're very blessed to be here. It's a beautiful part of the planet. But with respect to, I guess, where are we at in Australia? You know, as a black fella, these are stories I've been born and raised with, of the disrespect levelled at First Nations women in this country. And it's not uncommon in our communities of having and hearing these stories, particularly of First Nation, of white men perpetrating these kinds of violence against Indigenous women. I think where we're at, and I guess to the young people that are listening, you know, never forget the power that you have to create the change. That we, you know, is it women are 51%, I think, of the population or something like that. And, you know, that's a lot of power, and I think we need non-Indigenous women to mobilise when issues just don't affect them. We need them mobilised consistently. Like, if you're feeling frustrated, if you're feeling exhausted, imagine how First Nations women feel right now, because this is our day-to-day lives in this colony. But I think there is an opportunity in where we're at, and to the young girls who are tuning in, this is your moment now to step up to the plate. And embrace it, and not just allow the tension to diminish. Like, hold it with both hands and take it forward. Like, you know, we need to abolish these systems of power that just don't represent you or other women. So that's where I think we're at.
Yeah, Jen, also, you know, you work with human rights. You've been living in London and not here. How do you assess the situation in Australia right now?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about being Australian and an expat, you have the privilege and the benefit of sitting away from your country and observing it from afar and then coming back. And one of the things that struck me coming home this time is both the change of the conversation, but also how obvious the problem of white male privilege is in this country. And to give one example, the fact that our Prime Minister, in response to Brittany Higgins' allegations, and I pay tribute to her bravery in coming forward, had to relate it to his daughters to understand the seriousness and appreciate why he needed to take action, says everything you need to know about the problem of male leadership in this country, that he could only understand it through his relationship to his own daughters or how it related to him is a problem. It's not that she is someone's daughter, it is that she is someone. And that is a massive problem. I also think that it is problematic that in order for these cases to be taken seriously, the women involved have to out themselves publicly and talk publicly about some of the most horrific, traumatic experiences of their lives. This is not what should be required for proper action to be taken in response to sexual assault and rape allegations. And the fact that our current Attorney General is in the position that he is in and faces these allegations and nothing is being done about it is absolutely appalling. And if you're not outraged by this, and I want to express sympathy to the women around the country who are triggered by their own experiences of rape and sexual assault by having to read this in the media, then I don't know what will mobilise us to create change.
You're just on white male privilege, and there's been lots of talk about our patriarchal society and the influence. How do you think this would play out differently if there were more women in leadership positions and not so many white men? Teela, I might start with you.
Well, I think the danger is that sometimes white women can uphold the patriarchy. And I guess, you know, for me, for example, I never considered myself a feminist. It just wasn't a word that was in my vocabulary. I grew up in the western dusty plains of New South Wales, but, you know, I'm from a strong matriarchal background and kinship and community. And so I just think with, you know, and I work in a profession now that is dominated by white privilege, you know? Like I have to speak a certain way, dress a certain way. I was just telling a few panellists here some of my experiences of that. And I guess that's the challenge now. This year, Choose to Challenge, we all have to ask ourselves that question. What are we choosing to challenge? And I guess for me, it's about choosing to challenge white supremacy. It's about choosing to challenge colonial structures that have oppressed my people. And I think back to kind of where we are now, and especially to young girls who are feeling this discomfort, just choose to challenge your comfort zone and break free from it, because I think that's where the growth for our nation will happen.
Verity, just with your political insights, do you think this could play out very differently if there had been more women you know, in leadership positions?
I think Teela's right. Like, I think the problem we've got with the way politics is practiced in Australia, and I'm sure it's not only Australia, is that the actual way power is expressed in politics is a very patriarchal way to express power. So there's a lot of ruling through fear, not love. There's a lot of threatening and the sense that to actually express power in any real sense, you have to have the capacity to destroy someone. And I know that sounds a bit over the top, but that is how political power's played out. So it's a very patriarchal mode of power. So even if you're a woman in that situation, if you really want to get ahead, there's a certain respect that you actually have to play the game, and the game is still a very patriarchal mode. Having said that, of course it does matter. And I still remember in 1998, so I was a staffer in Canberra, there were literally no women there. I was very young, 24, felt completely alone and beleaguered. And in the 1998 election, all of these women on the Labor side got elected. It was the first year of affirmative action in the Labor Party, and so Tanya Plibersek was elected, Julia Gillard, Nicola Roxon. There was suddenly, literally overnight, about 20 young women. It was a really good generation of women too got elected. And I still remember being a staffer and sitting in the canteen down in Parliament House, and I was at a table and I realised all of these women were members of Parliament, and it really finally, I could actually go to them if there was an issue, or I could talk to them. It was so exciting to see the beginning of some sort of mass. But I agree, like, you can have all the women in the world, but unless you actually start to say there's a different way that we want to restructure the way we actually deal with power in this country, then...
Yeah. And the other thing, like, just on that point, is that there is just no accountability. When it goes down in this country, like, there is absolutely no accountability on white men in these positions of power. And that's the issue that the nation is grappling with right now. It's grappling with, okay, we have a effective criminal allegation, but then we have all of these different processes, whether they're criminal, civil, or investigative, whatever. People just don't know how to hold them accountable. And I just think that the problem is partly with the patriarchy that, you know, when things go down, there's just no accountability in anything.
Yeah, and this is really at the core that men, you know, women don't feel safe at work and men don't seem to be accountable to that. So I'll ask you, Kate, just also with your legal hat on, seeing it through that prism, what do you think?
I've got lots of thoughts about it.
To begin.
I think sometimes law is not the answer, and law can be a tool of oppression. And we need to look at our laws very carefully as women, but also as women of colour, women with disability, and women who identify as LGBTIQ+. So I agree with you that one issue that we have to be very aware of as white women is the extent to which we've adapted to male patriarchal structures, that we've taken on those characteristics. And so we need to think in a very inclusive way. I heard Melinda Gates talk recently, and I was really taken by the way in which she says, if you put gender right at the centre of policy making and think about the way in which women think, we think in systems. So we are used to organising our family. We are used to meeting the stereotype of being caring human beings. And so we have a different life experience than the sort of typical male who only has to be concerned about getting himself to work and succeeding in his work. And everybody else around him will attend to what needs to be done. Whereas the experience of women is organising systems. And if you can bring women's systems thinking into power and into the way we develop policy, then I hope, one, we have more inclusive structures that encourage women not to have to become like men to achieve power. We start to change the way in which we develop and think about policy, and we start to build inclusive societies, and we start to change the culture that the sort of male model of working and the hierarchy of achieving and going up the ladder is no longer rewarded, and that the rewards are something else. So for us as women, it's a bit of a challenge for us about how do we change the culture. And we used to say, let's just get in there, right? And so if we have more women and we're all there, everything will change. And in the law, half of the solicitors in New South Wales are women. It hasn't changed. So those sorts of things I think are sort of slightly deeper conversations that we need to have with ourselves. And unless we accept and understand intersectionality and inclusion, then there's a risk that we'll just repeat the sins of the fathers, the brothers and the husbands.
Yeah, Jen, do you agree that we're really living in a white man framework? You know, they set the norms and we just go along with it.
Look, I think there's a pretty simple answer to the question about whether it would make a difference if there was a woman leader. And I think the difference between how Jacinda Ardern would handle this, between the way Scott Morrison would handle this, I think we would see a marked difference. But I do think that we need to have more female representation in Parliament. I do think that over time that will see change. And it's not just white women. We have to see a representation of Indigenous women and women of colour who really represent our society. And we will see a change in decision making. There are studies after studies after studies about all industries, whether it's politics, law, or anywhere else, about when you have more women in leadership positions. And so it's not enough that we have 50% solicitors in this country. Let's talk about the percentage of women who are at the bar, who are at silks, who are made silk. What's the percentage?
Oh, we're about 1%.
1% of silks in this state.
1% of all barristers are women. So it's about 1.2%.
1%. So there are more than 50% of women going into law in this country, and 1% of us become silks. That is appalling. Now that's just one representation, but of course the law is a language of power and is a very powerful industry and is a feeder for politics. But if we look at our political structures and our political systems, that white men dominate those systems explains everything we need to know about why these cases are being handled so badly, in my view.
Yeah, so what do we do? You know, we're getting women in, obviously, and they're not rising. What do we change? How do we overcome that? Jen.
Well, I think representation is important. So I think encouraging women's leadership and building, I'm glad to see there's young women here in the room and young women who are watching this from afar, cultivating women from a young age to take leadership positions. And there's some really great organisations in this country now working on political leadership and fostering women to come through the ranks. New South Wales has the lowest representation of women at the local government level anywhere in the country, which was a fact I learnt the other day and I was shocked by and saddened by. It's about making sure that we have women in all positions. As RBG says, women need to be where all the decisions are made, wherever that is, and that's true, I think, in Australia. But the problem is that I think there's an issue about representation, and it's about making sure that we empower women to know that they have the right to be there, should be there, and need to be there, and fostering their leadership skills and creating the opportunities for them to be there, and in particular, Indigenous women.
Verity, you were a very senior woman in the New South Wales government. What did you have to overcome, or what were the challenges, and what assisted your rise?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So, I have said this to the part, all these people who go around and say, affirmative action is terrible, it has to be on merit, apart from the fact that merit, whose merit, how's that defined, and all of those sorts of things. It's just plain wrong. So what happened in the Labor Party in the mid-90s was a whole lot of women got together and enforced affirmative action requirements, which meant a certain percentage of women had to be pre-selected for winnable seats. And the first it was 40% and then it became 50%, right? And it sounds boring, but it actually worked. And it worked for both good and bad reasons. Bad reasons is it worked because it meant some of the male power brokers then went out and tapped you on the shoulder and said, oh, hello, person who's the wife of my friend, come along and things. So there was some of that, right? And it was definitely true that men sort of used it in their own power brokey ways. But it also meant that it gave other women confidence that they would be pre-selected, right? And it actually gave them an advantage, which is what men have had for the last million centuries, right? So you got an extra 10%. If you ran in an open pre-selection, you got an extra 10% on your vote. And over a period of 20 years, the Labor Party actually has managed to get basically 50% women in, right? So at federal level, it's 47%, but it's more in the Senate and at state. I think it's sitting around 50. It might even be more than 50 at state now. Yeah. Now, that took 25, it didn't even take 20 years. It probably took 25 to 30 years to turn that around. And that meant that at every time a safe seat went up, it had to be a woman. You look at something like where the Liberal Party's at, who refuse to have any structural interventions into actually getting women into those positions, they're at 25% and they're continuously electing men into safe seats. And I think it's sort of considered a bit old school, but without those really hardline structural interventions where you actually say, we are shifting the rules because the rules don't work, you will not get change in representation. And that's exactly the same for the issues of intersectionality as well. And that's starting to happen. We don't have affirmative action around intersectionality yet in the LP, but you can see it happening in terms of Aboriginal women and Aboriginal men getting elected to Parliament and so forth. But you actually do need to go and shake the power tree by its roots and put in interventions or it just will never change.
Yeah, so how, Kate or Teela, how do we do it so, not just in politics but across all industries, that some women get in, but then there's a gap and there's a lot of women that are being left behind?
I sometimes think that white people have too much faith in the system. We've all witnessed in the last 48, 24 hours the kind of the ways in which, take the monarchy, for example, how they just destroyed Meghan Markle, and that this is a woman of colour who made it, who on her own merit, she got there, she fell in love and was completely destroyed by an institution that has effectively colonised the world on racism, on a racist policy. And so bringing it back to this country, I think that we honestly have to have a conversation about dismantling structural racism and structural power, we really have to not have so much faith in being elected and getting here and there, but we have to actually have a conversation about what is our strategy, what is our goal, and how are we going to execute our strategy to get there. And part of my work and advocacy in the community has been around effectively trying to do that, which is one, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is effectively trying to carve out a voice within, through power for First Nations peoples across the continent, and with Wallama Court, which is around trying to, disrupt the way in which the courts function at the moment to try and allow the narratives of First Nations peoples to be heard fully and respectfully and with dignity in these processes, but at the same time try and rip away that colonial kind of coat that can really destroy so many First Nations peoples trying to survive in these systems. And I think both of those things, in my view, are about trying to dismantle structural racism, allowing First Nations peoples to have a voice and power, not through the status quo, but we actually really need to get uncomfortable with the status quo because we're such a relatively wealthy country in comparison to the rest of the world. And I think the other part of where I'm trying to kind of get my point to is I really think this country has to go on a journey of healing. Like, we're always talking about, power and systems, and especially my role as a lawyer. And one of the things is, Indigenous peoples in this country completely don't even accept the legitimacy of the structures on this continent because when it was invaded, it didn't even consider us as existing. So I just think that while we do have to grapple with where we're at in this moment in time, and for example, we are having more Indigenous people elected to Parliament, statistics for First Nations peoples have gotten worse over time. So we have to find better strategies and objectives on how we're really trying to grapple with the problem. For example, since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, there's been a 148% increase in First Nations women incarcerated. So we really have to kind of bring our minds and our goodwill together and, young women kind of tuning in now, what is it? What kind of world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in this kind of structure or do you want to recreate it into a world where you want to bring your children into? And I guess a country in Australia that respects the dignity and sovereignty of First Nations peoples. I think there are so many layers to this conversation. It's not just about power and structures. It has to be about healing the wounds from our nation's past.
And Kate, you're working with the Royal Commission into disability at the moment, and from that perspective and the stories you've been healing, in terms of assisting women with disability, what do we do there?
Well, we listen and we learn. One thing we don't do is give ourselves time, and I'm slowing myself down deliberately, to slow down and to pause and reflect on ourselves. And to do the macro work that you want us to do, each and every one of us has got something that we can do.
Absolutely.
We need to think about ourselves. And I say this because I have a 16-year-old. She's probably not watching, so I might be able to get away with things. But I often think, listen to a conversation like we're having today and you say, I can't, what can I do? How can I do that? And I'm listening to you to go, how can I do that? And I listened to the women with disability and I was like, how can I do that? So I can do the best that I can, but the starting point is myself. I have to think to myself, what are the biases that I carry in my life? How do I work out the assumptions that I make, often unconsciously, about the people I work with, about capacity of people to do things, about expectations in somebody's life? And if I can be aware myself and say, I need to learn more about the Indigenous community, how can I do that? Help me understand. Let me come and sit and listen and learn. And quieten down the busyness around ourselves and our sense, particularly as lawyers, we love to think we can fix everything. So we're in and we're fixing. But sometimes the best fixing is to reflect on ourselves and think about, what do I need to learn so that I can share and cooperate and collaborate in dismantling structures and powers. So listening to people with disability has made a very significant difference in what I need to do. And I need to do a lot more work in listening to elder Indigenous women. I'm completely intimidated by the elder Indigenous women because they can sit in silence and the power of their silence is overwhelming, and the discomfort that I feel because as a white fella, I was like, I've got things to say, right? And we fill the gaps with speaking. So I bring it all back to say the challenge that we have in ourselves is the starting point. Otherwise, it's easy for us to go, well, you know, I'm doing the best that I can. I'm a really busy person, so I'm just going to leave it to Verity to do all of this. And, oh, look, I am a bit sort of worried about Julian Assange, but, oh, Jen Robertson's got that done, so I don't need to worry about that. And Teela's the expert on the Uluru. So what we can often do is think somebody else has got that done, or they're like this amazing woman, I can't possibly do that. Bring it back to yourself and have a real good sense of yourself. What sort of person do you want to be? What biases do you carry? And how can you learn and listen to others? And I would hope like that allows us to have a partnership.
And you know, you made a particular point, which is actually what I spoke to Jen about the other day. I took some white friends home and they just couldn't shut up. And I was just like, when you're on country, when you're around the campfire, you actually don't have to say anything. Like you can just sit with your feet in the sand and the earth will speak to you, like it will. And it's something that I'm trying to kind of create more space to take my friends back to country and not expect to speak and feel the air so much. But, you know, hearing that from a non-Indigenous person, that is the challenge that you have. It's a real challenge. And I guess, you know, we have to continue to create space to allow people to sit with that discomfort, but embrace it and grow through it. And the other thing was, you know, you're right about the individual level of learning. The other, you know, my other little passion project is at Blackfella Book Club on Instagram, girls, get on there now. But really what I noticed through the pandemic was there were actually, so I created a book club with my friend who's also another Indigenous lawyer, and we just put it on Instagram and started posting all of our First Nations stories. And we'd noticed so many non-Indigenous Australians just embrace the platform.
I was one of them.
Yeah, and it's because they were deprived of this truth-telling and deprived in the systems and education systems of you know, First Nations storytelling, and we've just seen it explode. So I do think in spite of the things I've said, there are so many people who are willing to take the challenge that you've just identified.
Yeah, so then when we listen and learn, then what's the next step? What do you think in terms of changing it? Is it policies? Is it standard behaviours in workplaces? Is that how we change the culture? You know, how do we do that, Jen?
That's a huge question. Change what? Exactly.
The world.
The world. I think if we're going to talk about an inclusive kind of feminism, which is what Kate's just been talking about and what Teela and I talk about a lot, as I think all of us as white women, we need to consider our own privilege. And for me, as an Australian who has worked around the world with marginalised communities, I've had some pretty difficult reflections about my privilege as a white woman and my place in Australia, and how I use my privilege as a white woman, as a well-educated lawyer. And I think I invite other Australians to ask themselves that question, and how we then choose to use the power that we each have to enable Indigenous women in this country and create the kind of country that we want to see, which to me, I can't see a future of Australia that doesn't properly recognise our First Nations people and properly adopt the Uluru Statement and those asks. But in terms of the broader questions, I mean, coming back to some of the more topical issues that we've been talking about tonight, I, as a lawyer who has represented very high-profile women and not so high-profile women who have wanted to talk about their experience of sexual and domestic violence and have suffered massively for it, either through the adverse publicity that they've been through or through facing direct defamation suits by their accusers, by the people who violated them. I think this is a conversation that, for me as a lawyer in the space in which I work, I'm very interested in how we can create safer spaces for women to be able to come forward to talk about this and make it easier for the media to be able to report upon it. But I mean, look, it's such a big question you've asked. How do we change society? I mean,
in terms of,
but I think practically speaking, there are things, you know, like people need to seriously, like, you know, get engaged with your local members, like hold them accountable. They're there for a reason. Like, send them a letter. If you don't get a response, follow up. Like, that has been so much part of around mobilising things like the Uluru Statement, because it just keeps getting dismissed by politicians. The only thing, and I think this is another point to make, is like everyone here has made a practical difference in that movement, because it's been the Australian people that have kept it alive. They've kept it absolutely a live political issue. And I think that we need to kind of, like, understand the individual power we have and engage with it and not cop, you know, things every day. So, for example, the more difficult things, I think, are, you know, in your workplace is calling out racism. Like, say no. Like, this is not okay. Like, don't treat me that way. And for me, as a First Nations woman, I mean, I feel like I'm operating in systems that just don't actually fit me. Like, I don't fit at all in these systems. And so I constantly feel like I'm calling out things that can probably annoy other people because they just accept them as it is. But yeah, I just think, you know, and embrace your families. Like, lots of people ask me, what can I do? I'm like, you white people need to work on yourselves. Like, you know, you have to have the serious conversations about racism at your dinner tables. Or what I'm seeing now is kids are starting the conversations. Like, you know, there's so much, I think we underestimate how smart and intuitive kids are, and I think we need to embrace their conversations that they start as well.
Kate, in terms of feminism and in your work, the systems, how have they changed over the course of your career, or have there been big changes?
That's a good question.
I think rant about the law, come on.
Well,
I'm ready.
You're ready. Okay, so I decided that I would be a lawyer because I thought I could change the world. And I still think that, and though it's harder. And all I wanted to do was to do human rights law. And everybody said to me, that's not real law, actually. And I just, well, that's what I want to do anyway. So I've just sort of kept doing that. And Jen and I have had this conversation, I've just described myself as having a human rights practice, and that sort of seems to work so far, so good. So when I started law, I didn't think that I would ever experience sexual harassment or discrimination. So I did law in the 1980s, and when I started at a law firm, I just assumed, because I was smarter than a lot of the boys I was at law school with, that it would be fine and I would just get a fair go. So I think that was a bit surprising that I wasn't treated the same way as the boys that I studied with, because I wasn't expecting that to happen. So the one thing that's changed is if I speak to young women studying law now and I ask them, what do you think is going to happen? Sadly, they think, yeah, I'm probably going to be sexually harassed. There's a high risk of that. And I probably am going to experience being excluded because I'm a woman. So that makes me sad, but it also makes me realise that these are young women who come in knowing what the risks are, and therefore have the language and the power to call it out. So that's a big change. I think in terms of the respect of women, we have such great women leaders in the law, but they tend to be the sort of one-off trailblazers. And so it's building up that leadership and building up the diversity in the law. the other thing too is that women are now very prominent in academia, and women law academics have made a very significant difference to have the voices of women in law reform and discussions around what laws need to be made to protect women. So my whole life in the law has had the Sex Discrimination Act, and I've watched how that's evolved to make sexual harassment unlawful. I've watched how it's been used to run time and time again equal pay cases. I've watched how it's been used to confirm that women should have flexibility in their working lives. So I've seen laws work in practice very effectively to give women opportunity, but equally I'm a bit I'd just like it to do a little bit more. So I'm still very much in that law reform mindset. So the laws have changed and things have got better, but they can always get better. And they're better for white women, but they need to be better for women with disability, women from Indigenous backgrounds, etc., etc.
Yeah, Verity, I'd like to get your thoughts. Just in your working life, do you think that policies and procedures and attitudes towards women, have they changed?
Yeah, look, it's a bit like one step forward, two steps back, isn't it? Like, I think it'd be wrong to say things haven't improved. Like, it's clearly better than it was in 1950. I think the big thing about how do you change the world, right, is it is about, although having the right people in positions of power is always going to be useful, and it genuinely is, right? Like, you can't say that having a judge who is a good judge or having a Prime Minister who is a good Prime Minister is not important. It really is. They have a lot of power and a lot of capacity to change things. But on the whole, politicians tend to come after public opinion, not before it. So what Teela's talking about, which is actually building social movements and momentum for change, is incredibly important. And that's why it's not all about who you get elected to Parliament, or not all about who becomes a silk, but about the momentum and solidarity and systems that you create that mean that public opinion changes over time. And I do think that has happened. And again, although it feels like one step forward, two steps back, I do actually think over time the momentum of public opinion has moved in the right direction. Often ahead of the political class, often ahead of the judiciary, definitely, often ahead of the big institutions, but it has moved. And it's that movement that then is able to influence institutions. I used to always say to young people, you always need a bit of both, right? You've got to get the right people into Parliament, but mostly you've got to build the movement so that your good people that you've put in Parliament can then do the right thing once the actual momentum for change has
Now, we're running out of time, so we're just going to do some final thoughts. And I'll run down the line. One tangible change that you would like to see for women, to empower all women in the future. If there's one thing, what would it be? Verity.
You know what I would do, and again, probably everyone else will say something much more brilliant and I wish I'd said it, but if there was one thing I would do, that if you could do it tomorrow, it would be to value women's work properly, right? And what I mean by that is the fact that every single childcare worker is paid virtually nothing compared to a policeman. The fact that every single, aged care worker, they're all women and they're all paid terribly. The fact that all of the sort of stuff that glues society together, the caring roles, the community building roles, all the brilliant stuff that women do is basically completely devalued by the society in which we live. And I think that would help all women overnight, because it's us that are doing that work. So that is what I would change.
Look, I agree with that, but the thing I would add is make it mandatory for men to care for infant children.
Yeah, brilliant.
I think that we should abolish prisons, because that would have a big flow-on effect on the impact of Indigenous women being able to stay in their communities and be around their kinship, and that it would force, I think, this is my ideal world. Having abolishing prisons and then forcing, people in power to kind of filtrate those resources into the community to ensure that our communities actually are safe and that politicians aren't just living on this, policy of fear. And we're actually then kind of enabling communities where we're healing. I think if we can heal our Indigenous women and their hearts, we can absolutely heal the nation.
And Jen.
Well, I'm going to go from something far more systemic, which I think will solve a lot of these problems. Let's just take down the patriarchy.
Yes.
I mean, so much of all of the problems that we are discussing come from that root problem. All of us as women are having to live in a society that is structured by men, where our lives are determined by the structures that men have decided to create, and we have to fit into them in a way that doesn't reflect our time, doesn't reflect our biology, doesn't reflect our cycles, doesn't reflect who we are. And we've had to be forced to fit into that structure and to succeed in that structure. And it doesn't work for us. It has a distorting effect. And if we can take that down, just a small thing like the patriarchy, then we can succeed.
Well,
and on our own terms.
Perfect ending.
Well, I hope, thank you. Please thank our wonderful panel.
What a privilege that was to be part of that conversation, or at least to sit just from over there and listen to it unfold. I'm Jeni Whalan. I'm the Chief Program Officer here at the Paul Ramsay Foundation, and look, it's my job to thank these wonderful women who have just blown the roof off the discussion tonight. To Verity and Kate and Teela and Jen and Ashley, thank you so much for being with us. I was reminded on International Women's Day of some of the research that we've commissioned from here at the Foundation about cycles of disadvantage and their particular gendered effects. So we know that women and girls are overrepresented in poverty across all age groups, except for the over 65. Women and girls have lower social mobility than men and boys, and they're more likely to fall into poverty. Particularly, maybe this last 12 months of all, we know the dramatic gendered effects of COVID and the COVID recession that followed. And so that motivates a whole range of what we do here at the Foundation. There's a couple of themes really that arose for me out of the discussion tonight. We put collaboration and change and courage as some of the theme of tonight's discussion. I think that was evident. So too for me were 3 I's, right? Individuals, our role as individuals, our capacity for individual action, including when it's doing work on ourselves, but not sitting back waiting for someone else. Inspiration. So we heard from some of our speakers of the power of seeing others do it, but so too we've got in the room around us tonight some of our future leaders of tomorrow, girls from New South Wales public high schools. Another huge welcome to you. While we hope that you might have drawn some inspiration from tonight, know that we draw immense inspiration from you and the potential that you've got to step into this mobilisation and momentum, this particular moment right now, and that's what we need. And we heard of inclusion, right, for all women, with all women together. So I just want to thank you again so much for being with us. To the schools who are here tonight and watching, thank you so much for joining us. And to all of you who've come out to be part of this conversation, welcome and enjoy the rest of the night. Thank you.